Toronto, Canada's biggest city, finally joining the rest of the nation, getting the green light to reopen. The Ontario government today saying the Greater Toronto Area finally ready to move to stage 2, and that means millions of people will soon be able to go back to shopping malls, visit hair salons, and also go back to restaurant patios. Here's more from Doug Ford today, the Premier of Ontario.
Because of the progress we've made so far, I'm able to announce today that more of Ontario will be joining Stage 2 this Wednesday. As of June the 24th at 12:01 a.m., the City of Toronto and the Peel region will be allowed to enter Stage 2.
All right, let's bring in CTV's Colin D'Mello, who's following this story. I was there at that press conference virtually asking questions on behalf of CTV. Colin, good to see you. So this is obviously going to be big news for people in the GTA.
Yeah, for a lot of those business owners, it actually came as a bit of a surprise, Todd, because they were all expecting to reopen on Friday morning, but instead the government sped up the timeline by a couple of days. So in 48 hours now, those businesses like, restaurants for patios, malls, hair salons, nail salons, etc., they will be able to open up. And the finance minister says one of the things they were looking for is compliance with the regulations that they had set out. And they saw a lot of uptake, right? A lot of businesses were getting the proper PPE, installing plexiglass, really preparing for the eventuality of having to come in close contact with those customers once again. And so that's one of the reasons they felt comfortable to reopen. Now the big question is, some of the biggest malls in this country are obviously in Toronto. And so, the question is, will they actually reopen in 48 hours? And what will that reopening look like, especially in malls where you have thousands of people coming in from all over the province, the Greater Toronto Area, convening in one space? What's that going to look like? We don't know just yet.
Yeah, and obviously concerns about a second wave. And, it's interesting that Toronto, in many ways, Colin, is sort of the last place to reopen. Windsor, Essex, and the southwestern part of the province near Detroit is still in stage 1. But, Toronto is behind the rest of the country.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the largest number of new cases that have been popping up in Ontario over the last number of days have been centered around the Greater Toronto Area. So Toronto and Peel region, which encapsulates Mississauga and Brampton. Still, though, there is a big differentiation between what's happening in these two regions and what's happening in Windsor, Essex. So in Windsor, Essex, there now is outbreaks among migrant workers there. And, the Ford government is going to run into a bit of a challenge here because it seems like out of the 35 or so new cases that popped up, just one of them was in the wider community. The rest were all on, a handful of farms with migrant workers. And the government seems to be also shaping up for a bit of a fight with a lot of the farmers in the agri-food industry in some of these regions, because the farmers apparently aren't letting the migrant workers get tested for COVID-19, even though the government is committed to taking mobile testing centers to those farms. So this is going to be a huge issue, especially because there have been now 3 deaths among migrant workers in Ontario. Mexico stopped sending migrant workers up here. They just recently struck a deal with the federal government to say, okay, we'll start sending migrant workers back. So this is going to be a bit of a clash in the days ahead.
Yeah, and what about Windsor, Essex, too? I mean, for folks there, they've got to be frustrated. We know the border is going to be closed now for another month or so, and now it's anybody's guess when they may be allowed to reopen.
Right. You're talking about the livelihood of some of these folks, right? I mean, you think about somebody who might be operating a hair salon and they have employees who they may or may not be paying still, but they still have, the rent due, the electricity bills due. They've got provincial taxes, federal taxes that are coming up as well. I mean, all of these bills are piling up. And when they finally do reopen, it's all going to come cascading on them. So the question is, when are they going to be allowed to make any kind of income, and why are they all being held to the same standards of a couple of farms, right? In theory, you'd be able to kind of, put a ring around those farms and say, okay, well, nobody in, nobody out. But for the rest of the province, go ahead and start making a living once again. So that's going to be a real challenge there. And instead of frustration or disappointment, I think you're really going to start seeing anger in the days ahead. And that'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out.
Great to have you with us, Colin. Thank you for this.